So my name is Dr. Christina Baker. I am the director of the Liberal Arts Colloquium this academic year. So while we're doing our presentation, just a few ground rules. If there's any questions that you have for our presenter, we just ask that you guys save them for the end. We'll have a Q&A at the end. So if there are any students in the audience, but also faculty, I'm going to just pass around a piece of paper. So if you are a student and wanting credit for being here, please make sure to write your class and your professor's name in addition to your full name. So without further delay, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Budhathoki. He is an assistant professor in the Department of English who earned his PhD in rhetoric and composition at the University of Arizona. Before that, he earned his master's degree in English in Nepal and worked there as a lecturer and as an assistant professor of English. His research is interested in understanding the impact of linguistic and cultural differences in college writing instruction and how students cultivate rhetorical agency as writers in this era of generative AI technologies. His work has been published in a lot of journals, including Literacy and Composition Studies, Composition Forum, and Technical Communication Quarterly, as well as various different edited collections. Currently, he is co-editing a book about perspectives on translingual practices in teaching language and writing, and it's currently under review in Vernon Press. Very impressive. So the current presentation that he's going to be having is based on his research conducted in graduate school while teaching first-year writing as a graduate teaching assistant, and a research article version of this work is scheduled to be published in the Composition Studies Journal in spring 2026. And without further delay, I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you for the introduction, and thank you for being here. So, my topic, my presentation is Literacies and Reflective Rhetorical Moves in the Literacy Narrative Assignment. It is based on the work that I did in my graduate school and continue to build on it after that. And it is a journal article that is coming in the spring. And I'm going to share almost the entire article, but in a very brief and succinct way. So this presentation is overall about rhetorical move analysis of 30 literacy narratives written by the U.S. domestic and international students. And basically, the purpose of this study was to understand how the students' perceptions of literacy and how they reflect on their literacy experiences are interrelated. So with that question, I started this study, and the findings indicate that a translingual approach to literacy as ideological, plural, embodied, and locally situated, and a resource perspective to students' literacy experiences, they are important for meaningful reflection in the literacy narrative assignment. So the basic argument is that we need to adopt a translingual perspective to literacy, and we have to adopt a resource perspective to students' diverse literacy experiences. And I will show it how I came to this conclusion in the next few minutes. So overall, in this presentation, I will talk about a little bit about literacy narratives and reflection and translingual literacies as a kind of introduction to the study, and then I will share how I collected data and I analyzed them, and then I'll talk about, I'll discuss the major findings, and there are some pedagogical implications as a part of the conclusion. So I think literacy narrative is a very popular genre of writing. It is an assignment. I think most writing instructors used in first year writing classes. So there are, it was like popular at, early like in the 70s, and then there was like, its popularity has kind of, it has changed over time, but there is kind of recent interest in personal narratives as important genre of writing. So there is always a kind of debate in the academic writing about objective prose academic writing, convention-based standard norms and conventions, and the personal, more subjective and personal kind of writing. But in the recent years, there has been a growing interest in personal narrative. So some of the snippets of the researchers I have shared here, for example, literacy narrative, just to start, with a kind of introduction, is like it's a kind of personal narrative in which students talk about their experience of acquiring literacy. But how we define literacy and how we present it to the student is like there is a range of options. The default or the kind of the traditional approach to literacy is about a process of acquiring the skills to learn to read and write, the very narrow and traditional or the kind of standard definition of literacy. But there has been expansion of the definition of literacy to make it more broad and include all kinds of significant learning and impactful learning experiences that have changed people's understanding of themselves in the world and how they consider themselves as a literate being. So there are different schools of thought and different opinions, and basically this presentation and my research actually focus on that area, like how we present literacy to the students and what impact it has because of the way we present it to the students or the way students understand literacy. So, but even if there are disagreements about the scope of literacy or how we define it, whether we give it just to the learning to read and write and those basic, the autonomous kind of model of literacy as kind of skill set or toolkit that leads to upward mobility and success, or we broaden it to people's lived experiences, their embodied experiences, local literacy practices, and I think that is a kind of debate in which this research is grounded. So, regardless of those differences, the scholars have agreed that literacy narrative promotes personal agency. When students are able to write about themselves, they feel encouraged, they have a sense of agency, they have control over the content, and they don't have to mimic the kind of standard or the norms that they are not familiar with. And it also gives an opportunity to bring authentic experience to academic writing, which academic writing most of the time is very much distanced. It is just confined to the classrooms and the discourse community, and it generally doesn't have a lot to do with how we live and how we speak and how we communicate. So it brings this authentic kind of experience to academic writing. But there are some criticisms as well, for example, one criticism is that literacy narrative assignment, though it may be empowering to students, but it also presumes the hegemony of the written literacy. So we talk about literacy in writing, and if you focus on the narrow definition of literacy, then it might be we are just privileging one mode of literacy while ignoring many others. So this is the kind of general conversation, but it's one of the very popular assignments in the college writing, especially first year writing classrooms. And most instructors, as I do, love to start their freshman class with literacy narrative, inviting students to share about how they become the kind of literate being they are. Although there are some disagreements about the scope of literacy and its definition, there is a kind of near consensus among scholars that literacy narrative and reflection are closely interrelated. So as we know, it's kind of personal story and our personal experiences, so definitely it has some reflective element. So just like I quote Alexander, like on whose work my study is pretty much based. So, there is an expectation for reflection when we ask students to examine the significance of their experiences. So the moment we ask them to think about how important their experience is, or why they think that particular experience is important, then we are inviting them to reflect. We're inviting them to step back and go into kind of evaluative mode, and that is reflective. So that is something like inherent to the genre of literacy narrative. And also the researchers have found that literacy narrative brings an improved awareness of who the students are as readers, writers, and thinkers. So there is kind of consensus that literacy narrative promotes reflection, or they are closely interrelated. So, and further, when we talk about when the writers talk about reflect on their experience, and when they build on their prior knowledge about their writing, or when they reflect on their experience, then it also foregrounds the rhetorical nature of writing, because the reflection sort of forces students to think about the literacy practices in the context, because they have to come up with some kind of interpretation, some kind of meaning, and that orients them towards the rhetorical nature of writing process as well. Then what does it have to do with the translingual literacy that I talk about, which I argue is the right approach to literacy in literacy narrative assignment, and what it has to do with the reflection. So translingualism is an approach to language which is very much like multilingualism, in the sense that it acknowledges the existence of multiple languages, multiple linguistic practices and languages. But a noted difference is that while multilingualism acknowledges the existence of multiple languages, it treats language as discrete and bounded kind of phenomenon. That is something that is each language is like a kind of a bounded territory, or it's a kind of bounded phenomenon like English or French or any other language. So it is multilingualism accepts or acknowledges the diversity of language, but still maintaining the clear-cut boundary between them. Whereas translingualism, as the prefix trans indicates, it's transcending those boundaries and viewing all language and literacy practices, especially language practices, as fluid and it's negotiable. So both acknowledge the existence of multiplicity of language and literacy practices, but translingualism is more about the fluidity, and it does not necessarily believe in the linguistic boundaries or the language that is tied to nation state and territories. It is pretty much fluid. So what it has to do with the reflection is that translingual literacy, it counters the universal model of literacy, which is rooted in monolingual and monocultural language. So when we look at literacy as a set of skills, and it is like developing proficiency in a specific language, developing proficiency and developing skills in the number skills and whatever the literacy might include. And when we present it as one kind of literacy that applies to all, one set of literacy that if you acquire that, you get a kind of path to social mobility. You have job, you have career, you can move you can climb the economic ladder, or you can have that upward mobility. So that is a universalist kind of approach to literacy that believes in one particular set of skills applies to all. But translingual literacy counters that claim, and it believes that literacy is essentially local. It is about local practices. It is about people's embodied experience. It is more contextual. So what is being literate in one place is not a guarantee that you are literate everywhere. So my literacy in one place might make me or help me achieve something, or I may be able to get something done, but I may not be equally literate if I go to another place, because literacy is local, it is contextual, it is embodied. So translingual literacy counters that universal mode of literacy, which is basically rooted in monolingual and monocultural ideologies. So, and I will by the end of this presentation, I will establish why and how these translingual literacies and reflections are interrelated. So another feature of translingual literacy is, as I said before, is negotiated nature of literacy. So it is not that the universalist notion of literacy is it believes in a kind of the given nature of meaning. Like there is one meaning, there is one universal kind of meaning that is already given, and it is a task of the learners to discover that. Whereas a translingual literacy approach is more about negotiation. It is about being familiar with the differences and and then like trying to figure out a kind of common meaning. Like it is more about, like, it's not that the meaning is there already there, but it is something that you negotiate in the process. So this, and then when you look at this the literacy as kind of, translingual literacy as a negotiation, definitely it emphasizes more on the social, cultural, and historical context of different languages and literacy practices. And another important thing is that the translingual literacy does not see those differences as a liability, but as resource. So from a translingual perspective, if people have different understanding of literacy, if people have different kind of background, different kind of experience, and if they speak different language, that does not necessarily make them less literate or does not make them like a less of a learner. But when you have those people together, and then definitely there are tensions, there is struggle, there is like the opaqueness, the kind of lack of understanding, misunderstanding, and all those processes there. But ultimately, from that process, like the people develop more kind of more complex, more nuanced, and more insightful kind of understanding. That's what the translingual approach to literacy believes. Whereas the universalist approach to literacy as a kind of skill set or kind of a toolbox that adheres to a particular language and a particular culture, that does not find that kind of differences as resources. From the universalist perspective of literacy, those differences are the barriers because they stand in the way of smooth communication. So, from the universalist point of view, the smoothness, the clarity, the conciseness, like all these things are valued, whereas translingual literacy values opacity, the kind of confusion, the kind of creative tension, and out of which something more meaningful and something more rewarding comes. And then that brings to the point that when we start focusing more on the context, the historical, cultural, and social relations and context of the literacy, then the literacy becomes, as Kanagaraja says, intrinsically rhetorical, meaning we are not looking literacy as something in isolation, but something rooted in the context. And when we acknowledge, when we take the entire context into consideration, then our approach is rhetorical, and which is very important, especially in the college writing, because our approach to writing is always rhetorical, and in this study, like I found a kind of through line that translingual literacy is rhetorical, and reflection is rhetorical, and how that, and then the way we teach writing our students is also, our approach is always rhetorical, and that is how I find how the this translingual approach to literacy promotes more meaningful reflection, and that also, my claim is that that also promotes more meaningful and rewarding kind of writing experience for these students. So, yeah, and here comes the point, like, how reflection is rhetorical. So reflection is rhetorical in the sense that if we take reflection as an act of meaning making, like when we ask our students to make sense of their experience, then what we are doing is we are asking them to give meaning to their experience, meaning creating something. So that is essentially a task of knowledge making. We are asking them to come up with something. Then that is kind of meaning making and knowledge making activity. And in that sense, it is rhetorical act. And reflection, like I also like draw on the this color, like the very like basic, I would say the very may not be like the earliest one, but the pretty early, like concept of reflection by John Dewey. Like his definition of reflection that came in like in 1920s and 30s is like an active, persistent, and careful consideration of any belief or supposed form of knowledge. So it is also like pretty much like close to like what like Yancey calls rhetorical. So this is like in order to like, and sometimes when we talk about like the reflection, we use the term a lot, but like what exactly we mean by reflection? Then I find this Dewey's definition very helpful. It is an active, persistent, and careful consideration. Like it's not just like students write about their experience and like not being deliberate, not being like intentional, and like just like ending up with like wherever like they end up being. Like not that kind of free-flowing writing, but being more persistent and more active to find the meaning of the experience. So with this and the kind of scholarship I have reviewed definitely in more detail in my article. So how I define reflection in literacy narrative, then drawing on all these rhetorical and functional approaches to literacy, to reflection, for the purpose of my study, like I define reflection in literacy narrative as the student writer's deliberate effort to define their literacy in relation to their lived experience and their effort to understand how those experiences have shaped their literate selves or who they are as a literate being. So this is the focus in my study on reflection, as how persistently, how deliberately students try to make sense of their experience, how they interpret it, and then how they try to understand the impact of those literacy experiences on their literate selves. So, and yeah, here is another like intentional attempt to synthesize, abstract, and articulate. Like this also is pretty much I find very helpful to operationalize like the kind of the concept, like how do I identify, how do I analyze, how do I look for reflection in a literature narrative and in their narrative. So whether there is an intentional attempt to synthesize, abstract, and articulate the key lessons taught by their experience. So this was a very helpful concept. In terms of methods, I use the rhetorical move analysis as a method. So move analysis is a popular concept in genre studies, and where move analysis basically looks at the function achieved by a particular section of the text. So it is more about what the text does than what the text is or what the text means. So since it is more functional, like what particular function a specific text or a specific group of words. It can be like as small as a word, or it can be a phrase, or it can be a sentence. So what exactly that does in the text? So that is rhetorical move analysis. And here is a very widely quoted, cited definition of move by John Swales. It is about move in general analysis is a discourse or a rhetorical unit. Again, the piece of text, the extract that I look at in the literacy narrative, it is analyzed as a rhetorical unit. So it is, and the focus is on what does the writer achieve, or like what does that text do in the text. So it is not like what it means, but what it does. So this is the kind of more functional and rhetorical approach to move analysis. And I use the concept of move analysis from John Swales as a move as a kind of discursive and rhetorical unit that is more functional. And then I built on the work by Kara Poe Alexander, who has done work extensively on literacy narrative. And I found her 2015 article to be very, very helpful, in which she has identified 3 key moves that writing instructors, they look for when they grade their paper for reflection. So, and the Alexander's study is from the instructor's point of view. Like, what are those moves that writing instructors see in the student's paper that makes them believe that the student is reflecting? This is the reflection. And those 3 moves were, one is a logical analytic move, in which there are cause and effect structures and evaluation. It means the student in their narrative, they are drawing some kind of, they are using some cause and effect structures, talking about the literacy experience, and they are sharing their evaluation. So that is kind of logical, analytical kind of move. That is one. And the number 2 is metaphoric language with vivid evocative details. So the metaphoric use of language, how they use the metaphoric language, as well as what level of descriptive, evocative kind of vivid descriptive details they use in the narrative. That is the second move. And the third one is critique of ideologies and values, and to what and how, or whether or how the students critique the ideologies. Maybe it can be the monolingualism, or like the monoculture, or the concept of literacy, or any kind of ideological critique. And when I looked at these 3 moves, and I thought that it is interesting to see like how these moves are, whether these moves exist in the students' literacy narratives or not. And then, but I had kind of limitation in my data source, because out of 30 narratives, the first 15 written by US domestic students, it was my anomaly study, a case study, in which I developed the study, I developed the assignment, and then I taught it in the class. I collected their writing samples, I collected their reflection, and I interviewed the students as well. So I had a kind of insider's perspective, and I had kind of 360 kind of understanding of that assignment and the project. But the next 15 literacy narratives, which I call like Group A and Group B, they were written by international students at the same university, but those students come from different sections, different classes, taught by different instructors. So I got that from a repository, a data repository. From there, like I just like gained access to those narratives, and I went through all the IRB process, and I followed like all that the ethical practices of data collection for that. So I didn't know, I just had the narratives, I didn't know the students, I didn't know how they were taught, who taught them, and I didn't have additional reflection. So, but what I did is like, in my first study, I triangulated all different kinds of data sources, but for this study, I just looked at the literacy narratives only. I didn't look at reflection. I took 15 literacy narratives by US domestic students, and 15 written by international students. And that kind of made me sort of hesitate to look at the critique of ideologies and values, because I would need a little more information about the way the assignment was presented. So I thought it is appropriate for me to look at only the first two, the logical analytical move with evaluation and metaphoric language. So, yeah, and this is the information on the 15 by US domestic students and 15 by international students. And then there is some demographic breakdown. Among the 15 US domestic students, there were like 8 monolingual students, there were 6 bilingual, and 1 was multilingual, but they were all US citizens, though some of them were born outside the US. Like there are like 6 bilinguals, like most of them have like Spanish as their first language, but it was all, in terms of nationality, they were all US domestic students. International students, I was able to get the demographic information. There were like 7 Chinese students, 2 Saudi Arabian, 1 Brazilian, 1 Kuwaiti, 1 Mexican, 1 South Korean, 1 Taiwanese, and 1 Russian. So it was, it was like maybe as diverse as it could get. So for the purpose of data analysis, my approach was informed by the grounded theory, because like I was the person to collect the data and analyze it, and my approach was pretty much like inductive initially. I started out with the inductive and open-minded kind of approach, like reading the narratives and then like trying to find the themes and patterns and like keywords and like that. And then it was like a small batch of narratives, so I did everything manually. I coded manually. But as I like moved ahead with the analysis process, I could not remain totally inductive, because I have these the taxonomy of Carl Alexander Poe. Like I have that moves like analytical move, and then these are the things that I am like entering the data, so looking for them. So like it was like initial like inductive. I started out inductively just to feel like what the narratives are, like where things are, but it was a kind of like more than a deductive kind of approach. So it was kind of mixed like between like inductive and deductive, and I use like the literal or a verbatim kind of coding where that values the students' words and exact words to locate where I can find those reflective modes. So after the analysis, I was able to locate reflective rhetorical modes as a discursive rhetorical unit that either indicates the analytic move of evaluation of their experience, or there is a use of metaphoric language or vivid descriptive details. So I considered only those two. And I found that there were like, I just like concentrated on like 3 locations, like in the title, in the body paragraphs, and in conclusion. So in the title, I developed this category like based on the data, that there were some titles that were very expressive titles, kind of metaphorical representation. They were like metaphoric in a way, kind of figure of speech, in which they are, and that was like highly reflective in the sense that they have to think hard to come up with a word or a phrase or kind of figure of speech that best represents the essence of their narrative. So that is kind of highly reflective kind of move they are making in the title selection. There were other categories like which was thematic title that was not highly reflective, but that was reflective of the content, because their title would reflect what they are talking about, what kind of literacy experience they are talking about. And there were a few like generic title like literacy narrative or my literacy narrative or literacy, and that is little or not much reflection on that part, because they are calling it a literacy narrative, then I think they didn't think much about it. And there were some narratives, there were no title at all. So there were the 4 categories. And What I found is, in the group A narrative, there were 9 expressive titles, like examples like hiding and seeking, overcoming borders. These were the reflective titles out of 15. And there were 6 thematic titles, and there were no generic or missing title in one group. Whereas in the other, I found there were 5 expressive titles and 7 thematic titles, and there was 1 generic title, the person called their narrative like literacy, and there were 3 narratives without a title. And looking at the body paragraph, I found some interesting and insightful reflective moves in both narratives. Here are like a couple examples. So in the first one, a student shares the experience of learning a different genre of writing in a science genre, and like how it was the rewarding experience and what the student learned from it, what kind of problem the student faced like that. And then in group B, a student like talks about the experience of giving a presentation as an international student in the US. So like there are reflective modes in both narratives, but the one major difference is that in group A narratives, there are higher number of reflective modes per narrative, and they are also more detailed. And here, like I have to explain, like there is a little bit of context. First of all, in a group A narrative, since it was a part of the study that I designed, there was like more emphasis on reflection. And I was more deliberate in the way I presented the assignment, which I will talk in detail a little bit in detail later. And even in terms of length, like in Group A, the narratives were slightly longer than the Group B narratives. So here, that's why like what I'm trying to do here is, I'm not trying to pit like one group of narrative against other, and then like trying to, I mean, of course it is a kind of comparison, but in my method, the part I skipped, which is in my article, is that I call it like descriptive comparison. It is a kind of combination of both description and comparison. Comparison is inevitable because I have 2 sets of data, 2 different demographics, but still like my approach is not to just show one is better than others, but just to remain open and exploratory in my approach to see what might have caused those differences and discrepancies. So here, what I'm trying to clarify is, Group B narratives were shorter, slightly shorter, like by in average, like short, it was like by 200 words, and those were the regular classes. Like these students taught those classes, and they were not doing any study, so perhaps they were less deliberate, they were less intentional and less forceful about reflection and all those things. So that might be, but still. And this makes sense, like in my main argument that when we look at all these reflective rhetorical moves, and then I draw a conclusion that it is more about the way literacy was perceived by the students and literacy was presented than how the assignment was designed. So I think I'm still perhaps I'm holding that point because that's the final point, and that will brings us back to my main argument. So the point is that both narratives have reflective modes, but one has more, Group A has more, and it has more detailed reflective modes. In the conclusion, conclusion is generally when you write a conclusion, and that is the place where everyone becomes reflective, whether they are asked or not, because we have to we have to tie all the loose ends and just have a final thoughts, and that means that is we generally become reflective. And but what I found is, and this was a kind of a little bit surprising to me, because I was expecting that in conclusion everyone is going to step back and be a bit more reflective, but it showed a huge discrepancy. In Group A narrative, there were 12 out of 15 narratives where there were noticeable and detailed reflective mode, whereas In Group B narrative, there were only two narratives where I could find the reflective modes. Others were pretty much like, again, like talking about literacy, defining it, and kind of, it makes like all different kinds of move, but reflection. So, then how to make sense of all these things? I mean, like, there are different narratives taught by different people, different classes, slightly, around the same time, but it's still like, a year or two apart. At the same institution, one is international, exclusively international students, English 107. One is US domestics, or like the regular first year writing, where international student can be also there, but it's a kind of regular English 101. Then what my findings shows that it was like more about how the literacy is perceived by the students, and I was able to like find that when I focused on this category. So I looked at like, since like all the narratives or the students in Group B, they were international students, so they were obviously bilingual, at least English was not their first language. Then how do they, approach language? Or what kind of topic like they have used? And when I looked at this, and I found that language difference was at the center of only 3 narratives in Group A. So, whereas in Group B narrative, 8 out of 15 students wrote their narrative about language difference, about struggle of learning English and like taking TOEFL and other tests, and like how they struggled with the language and language difference, and why it was important to them. But more importantly, what I found is, even in those 3 narratives where they talk about language differences, because they were bilingual and there was one multilingual student as well, and some of there were students whose first language was not English, but no student explicitly showed any kind of deficit perspective. And here, like, there are the new two, like, and I talk about resource perspective, which goes along with the translingual approach to literacy or translingualism, whereas the deficit perspective is like feeling of inadequacy, feeling of insecurity, and like feeling like outsider. So that is a deficit perspective, and like they don't see any strength or anything good coming out of their being different. That is a deficit perspective. Whereas a resource perspective is that they think that, okay, I'm different, so meaning like I should be happy because I have something different, I can build on it, I can show it off, I can work on it. That's the resource perspective. And there is a kind of correlation between these resource and deficit perspective and how they talk about their language. For example, out of these 8 narratives in which they talk about language difference, 5 of them have, like, their narrative is full of deficit perspective. They are like, they do not see anything good about their linguistic difference, or like they just talk about like the struggles and like all the negative things about their language. Whereas, and I have some excerpts like that that will show like the kind of contrast. Whereas in Group A narrative, they acknowledge that they were different. One student talks about the struggle of transitioning to US high school and how it was difficult, and because English was not her first language, but she writes that like she overcame it when by the time she reached middle school, and then like her friends who used to mock her and then like make fun of her started like asking her for help, and kind of, I mean, like the tone overall is more celebratory, and then like more resource perspective. And then I looked at another category in which if some of the, and those were like the language at the center of literacy, but when I looked at like what other forms of literacy they have explored in the narrative, so in Group A narrative there are 5 topics like music, travel, like alternative literacy practices they have written, and all 5 of them have maintained a kind of resource perspective. They are proud of their literacy experience. And when I looked at the Group B narrative, there are also 3 narratives in which they did not talk about language difference, but they they chose other literacy experience, like they talk about video games, like cross-cultural experience of traveling and all those things. And out of those three narratives, alternative literacies, they all had kind of resource perspective. They were more proud of their experience. They were like celebrating it. So, and it is giving a kind of connection that when you look at your literacy experience from a very narrow perspective, and you always perceive your literacy in relation to a quote-unquote standard or a norm, and you always find yourself like in deficit, then that sort of like discourages you from talking about literacy in an authentic way and then reflect on it and having pride on you. But if you look at, that's not only this literacy, I think I have like other significant learning experiences in my life. For example, like being good at video games or traveling to a place and like knowing about new culture, they are maintaining resource perspective. And that goes hand in hand with the translingual approach to literacy. So translingual approach to literacy promotes a broad and contextual and local practices of literacy, and it does not have to be like one thing or one kind of skill set. Then here is an example of like diversity perspective. Like this, a Chinese student talks about his frustration about not doing well at this taste of English as foreign language examination, and this is like pretty like heart-wrenching kind of detail. Like, and he says like, I really would like to give up, and after that I thought I would not have the second try because I thought I did not have the talent or another reason, which I did not want to learn abroad. So I mean, the kind of it appears that other than mastering the quote-unquote standard English, as if there is no other form of literacy that you could be proud of or you could cultivate. So this is what is a typical example of deficit perspective. And there is a resource perspective that I just mentioned before. Like this is a student who, from her narrative, it appears that she immigrated from Southern America and South America, and like it was English was not her first language, but over time she did well, and she says that people made fun of me and then like they mocked my accent, but the tables are turned and they started asking me for help. So I mean, and another student says like, I got the opportunity to be 100% bilingual from an early age, and like this is something the person is proud of. And if the person is bilingual does not mean, it definitely means that English is not their first language, then definitely they don't have that native competency in English, but the person does not regret that. The person is proud of being bilingual. So this is an example of resource perspective. And here are some two other excerpts from Group D narrative that further supports my claim. So here, like two students, like one student talks about, in his narrative, talks about how he developed those Chinese characters using Pinyin as an official romanization system of Chinese and creating some interesting English according to Chinese. He talks about that in his narrative. And another narrative talks about Lu Xun being his favorite writer, their favorite writer, and then when I read Lu Xun's novel, I know how to organize my article, how to make it easier for readers to follow my idea. So I take both of these examples as a very, very promising, move the students are making towards their vernacular literacy and their own, like, not like looking at Lu Xun as a kind of, his writing style as a way to organize his writing, or developing something like own kind of English. But when I further looked, analyzed their narrative for reflective rhetorical moves, I found that none of these writers foreground that as their main literacy experience. So that is not the central theme of their narrative. That only comes just just like it comes as a kind of side reference, but not the actual narrative. So it was, and I think like this is a kind of missed opportunity to cultivate this literacy or vernacular and the local literacy. So the conclusion I have drawn from this study is that, so it is this presentation, like, I want to clarify this. This might look like it's a kind of two different blocks of literacy narratives written by two different group of people, and they are different from each other, which they are in many regards. They are different, but there are a lot of similarities. For example, the purpose of my presentation is not to show that the narratives written by the international students, they always have fewer rhetorical moves. That's not the case. I mean, in comparison, there are few, but there are some really good rhetorical moves as well, which are more detailed, which are more insightful, some of them. But in total, they are fewer, and they are like less detailed. So, for example, in this previous section, like I talked about, in this example, I talk about the writers like approach literacy as their local vernacular literacy practices, but they fail to foreground it, because they could have written a magnificent narrative, a very great narrative on this experience, and they would, it would be perhaps they would definitely, like, since it was something they did and which is not about just learning or like preparing for TOEFL or like learning English, definitely they were more comfortable, they knew more about it, and they were more confident about it if they had chosen to foreground this as their significant literacy experience. And my understanding is that they did not do so because literacy was not presented to them as something that allows them to draw from their authentic and lived experience. Literacy generally, by default, literacy is always presented in a narrow sense as a kind of a set of skills. And that is something that if you gain those skills, you are successful. If you don't have those skills, you are falling behind, or like, or you are unsuccessful. I think that sort of narrow, autonomous model of literacy, which in a way favors one specific language, one specific culture, and also it has an assumption that what is valid in one place applies to everywhere. The universalistic approach to literacy, I think, that prevents students from exploring these rich literacy experiences, which could which would perhaps help them write a more meaningful and more impressive kind of literacy narrative, and perhaps that narrative would have more reflective moves that I was looking for. So then the conclusion is that it is there are other factors. I'm not in my study. I'm not disregarding other factors like the assignment design and how it was taught and all those things. But at the center of this difference is that the literacy was not presented. Literacy was not perceived in the right way. So my claim is that approaching literacy from a translingual perspective as a broad and nuanced concept, it is a kind of broad and nuanced concept of literacy as a plural. It's not just a literacy, but it's literacies, because there are multiple kinds of literacies. It is locally situated, it can be embodied, it can be ideological, and when we embrace those different literacy experiences and language practices as resource to build on, then that leads to more meaningful, reflective moves in literacy narratives. And conversely, if you use the autonomous universalistic concept of literacy, that stifles students' meaningful reflection. So my final point for pedagogical implications, so what it means for the writing instructor. So first, I have already said, of adopting a translingual literacy that goes beyond the binaries, that is one, very helpful. Next is, this is from my experience of conducting my first study, which is related to this study as well, in ways sharing instructors' literacy experiences and encouraging them to have cross-cultural conversations and sharing their experiences, and of course like assigning readings from multiple diverse perspectives and class discussions, peer reviews, and all these kind of activities, a kind of figurative kind of border crossing in the classroom that really kind of enhances their understanding of literacy. That is the second one. And third one is reflection is often used as a kind of afterthought. Like you write and write and write and finally you reflect. So instead of doing that, integrating it in the narrative and like scaffolding it with small activities and making students constantly aware of the need to reflect, rather than just asking them to reflect just at the end. I think that would be a good way to tease reflection. So I think I will conclude by reading out the final section of my article, in which I find this quote very, very useful. So the kind of reflection which is more ritualistic or kind of afterthought, it doesn't facilitate a kind of deep dive into the intricacies of literacy development, which is personal, social, cultural, and political at the same time. And also we should be mindful that students may have different understanding of reflection than what the assignment expects. And more so with the students from different cultural backgrounds who may not have the shared vocabulary to operationalize the concept. Sometimes we talk about reflection all the time, and there might be so many students who do not share that vocabulary and they may not know what we mean by reflection. So it is very important to break it down, in the way they can understand what we mean by this concept of reflection. So I end my this presentation as well as my article with a quote from Kara Alexander. She cautions, although the purported goal of assignments such as the literacy narrative is to be inclusive and equitable, we risk excluding students who do not share our values and thereby marginalize students who are already in such positions, unquote. Therefore, it may not be enough to foreground reflection as the central component of literacy narrative unless we make it accessible to all students. So, yeah, this is what my article and my presentation is about. I'm happy to
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. So now we will open the floor up for any questions that folks have. So feel free to ask any questions about the presentation that you have.
Please.
Yeah, trying to understand reflection a little more. Do I understand it as a kind of, when you say, is it going to be different than in each application? By that I mean, there at the end you were mentioning a different assignment style and those sort of things. So will reflection mean something different kind of on an individual basis? Or am I understanding that correctly? Or am I even making sense of my question here?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I think you're trying to understand how understanding of reflection might be different, right? But maybe I think what I'm trying to say is, and yeah, I think definitely individual understanding differs, right? People understand it differently. But I think first of all, it is important to, from the instructors or teachers' perspective, I think it is important to have the clear-cut kind of expectation of this is what I mean by reflection, this is what you need to do. I mean, that may sound sometimes very simplistic in an academic way, in the academic context, but in the classroom context, I think sometimes being simplistic is helpful, right? But Another important thing is that still, like, students are going to understand that in a different way, and maybe it is something like it depends on, like, if students, like, for example, even like personal narrative, some students find very difficult to write, and others find it very, very easy to write, because some people, they come from kind of culture where they are not accustomed to talk about themselves, or just to talk about their achievements, or even like talk about their struggles, right? So the point is that I think what I'm trying to say is, maybe from the instructional point of view, having a clear set of terminologies or definitions or whatever you call it, like to share with the students, like, what I mean by reflection and what you are supposed to do or what we expect you to do. And then if there are students with, like, they're really struggling, or if they have, like, different kind of understanding, that is, I think, something we have to work on, or work with the students, and perhaps ask or hear, like, from them, like, what their understanding is, what and how I think, yeah. But yeah, I think there is no, I mean, the point is, it's like, it's a different, as well as we need to have, like, a certain general understanding, general, like, terminology. I think if I answer your question, I don't know.
Yeah, I appreciate
Okay.
it.
Have you found that if you can get students talking about alternate literacies, especially ones that they have, I forget what term you use, not the deficit one, but
The resource, yeah.
Yeah, the resource, the positive experience. If you can remind students of that, does that have any impact on literacies where they might consider themselves to be in a deficit situation? Do you know what I mean? I mean, reminding them. I would just think of it in terms of reminding students that they all have expertise in something, right?
Yeah.
And if they can look at themselves from that perspective, then can that help them as they engage with a new literacy, or different kind of literacy, or even a different kind of discursive situation?
Yeah,
I wonder if it would have-
I think, like, yeah, that's a great question. I think I see, like, I think there's two things in your question. Like, one is maybe, like, that is a kind of inevitable kind of situation. We put ourselves in kind of classroom research or teacher research, right? So we are designing assignments, and we are asking students to respond or write in a certain way, and we are collecting data. So that part is always there. So maybe, like, to what extent their responses were prompted, right? Or, like, because of the assignment design, like they responded in a certain way. I think it was in that direction as well. I think that's the inevitable part of this kind of classroom qualitative research. But I think to your another point, I think it may not necessarily be, like, transferable to a new situation, right?
Yeah.
If at all, like, learning is transferable, like, that's also another murky area, right? Whether it is transferable. But definitely, if a student, especially the first-year students, if they come to the class and taking their first writing class, and if they can produce something that is meaningful to them, and that sort of, like, that sort of, like, kind of affirms their, like, identity as a writer, and I can write, this is my narrative, and, like, they just, like, kind of reflect on, like, how they have come here, how they have arrived here, and what their learning journey has been like, learning experiences have been. I think that would definitely make them more prepared, more confident. But I wouldn't say, or maybe, like, I think it would be, like, difficult to claim that the kind of literacy that the literacy they already know, or the kind of research perspective necessarily that transfer to another. But definitely they will be better, they will have a better disposition, better preparedness to the next writing task.
Well, I certainly wouldn't expect you
Yeah.
to see miracles in
Yeah.
the classroom. I was just curious.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wanted to ask about your, I think it was, you coined it the rhetorical moves analysis that you inherited. I hadn't encountered that idea before, but I wondered what that looked like in your inductive reasoning. I mean, is that you sitting with the paper and manually parsing those discrete rhetorical moves, line by line, sentence by sentence, or if you had some system for that, how you approached it?
Yeah, that is like, yeah, basically, it's a little bit like a messy process of like the qualitative research, right? So there is no control or anything or like that, because then like even in the same class, like the 15 narratives, like they are like of 15 different types, right? So it is basically like first reading with an open mind, and then like when we like reread it over like multiple times, and then like we can start seeing some kind of pattern, some kind of like the repetition, and then from there, like if it is like purely inductive, then I think which is also questionable, like how purely it can be inductive, right? Because you're already there with research question and your research design, and you're trying to find something, and you cannot negate yourself like totally. But even in that, like quote unquote purely inductive reasoning, I think it is, or inductive kind of process of analysis, I think it is more of like getting all those variables, those are very much discrete and different at first, and then from there, like narrowing it down to certain themes and categories, and that is how it works. And in my case, I just like started out inductively, and then later it was like, pretty much because I had those two basic rhetorical modes that I was looking for, and I was like more focused on those, and I just ruled out others. So it is always a little messy and very subjective. The qualitative is very, I think, and I think maybe if like very well designed and like kind of research, and maybe like there may be like more kind of a possibility of replicability and then like all those things, but otherwise like it is more of finding those patterns and themes. And I use the concept of linear or the literal, or that verbatim coding is that typically like going for those words and the phrases that is associated with that reflects the kind of moves, effective moves, rhetorical moves that are going on. But when you start to talk about like the rhetorical, is like, and the focus is always on like, it's not just about like the finding certain words, but what is that particular phrase or word doing in the sentence? What is it achieving? So it's not in isolation, right? But it is like looking in the context, whether it is making some kind of evaluation, if the writer is evaluating their literacy experience. So it's all combination of all.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense.
Okay, so I want to thank everybody for coming today. As a reminder, there's snacks up here, so let's give Dr. Budhathoki another round of applause for his wonderful presentation. So our next and last Colloquium of the fall semester will be in December. It's going to be December 2nd, so please make sure to mark your guys' calendar for that. But thank you all for coming.
Especially with that convergence of AI literacy as a social movement. Like, does that create that space for continued?
Yeah.